I now recognize Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Weingarten, are you a medical doctor?
I am not.
Are you a mother?
I am a mother by marriage.
By marriage, I see.
And my wife is here with me, so I'm really glad that she's here, Rabbi Sharon Klein.
Ms. Weingarten, and you haven't taught school since the 90s, so you're not a teacher anymore.
I am actually, Representative, I'm actually on leave from my teaching position, and this fall I will be teaching as a guest teacher at Cornell, my alma mater.
When was the last year you taught? 1997, is that correct?
The last time I taught a full class was June 1997.
Okay, that's been quite a long time, approximately 26 years ago. Do you believe in the First Amendment, Ms. Weingarten?
I believe in the Constitution, including the First Amendment, of course.
Oh, great. Well, I'd like to remind you of one of your tweets here where you agreed that my suspension on Twitter, in your own words, politicians shouldn't be exempt from standards about spreading misinformation. Green has repeatedly shown reckless disregard for those standards. This suspension is justified. This is your tweet. Just last year, January 2nd, 2022, I was suspended for my statements about COVID-19 as a member of Congress, by the way. And also, I'd like to point out by the emojis by your name here, it looks like you're more of a political activist than anything. Clearly, unfortunately, you think Ukraine comes before the United States. I'm not sure what the black flex is. I mean, is that digital blackface? But congratulations on graduating from school. But I'd like to
No, it is about honoring black
Ms.
educators.
Weingarten, I reclaim my time. I didn't ask you a question.
Sorry.
What I'd like to talk about is your recommendations to the CDC as not a medical doctor, not a biological mother, and really not a teacher either. So what you did is you advised the CDC.
Mr. Chairman, that's
Excuse me, this is my time. You advised the CDC to have schools provide remote work, options for staff that have documented high-risk conditions who are increased risk for severe illness from COVID-19 to limit the risk of workplace exposure, telework, virtual teaching opportunities, modified job responsibilities, environmental modifications, scheduling flexibility, temporary reassignments to different job responsibilities. None of your advice had to do with to stop the spread of COVID-19. It was all about teachers staying home. And there was big results of that. Let me tell you, I am a mother, and all 3 of my children were directly affected by the school closures, by your recommendations, which is something that you really can't understand. I'd like to point out, let's talk about the real effects of this. Obviously, we know the test results. Oh, and by the way, you celebrating what I had said on Twitter, I had said that children should be in school. I had said the truth, that children were not dying at high rates of COVID-19 like older people were. I had also advocated for our children, not for teachers getting to stay home and kids being forced into virtual schooling. I advocated for the safety of our children and for their education. But you, as a political activist, for the president of the teachers union, we're not advocating for anything good for our kids, and our kids have suffered greatly. As a matter of fact, suicides increased. Their rates of learning went down. And you know what else happened to them? Anxiety, depression, all kinds of problems happened to kids. And then ironically, here's something that was shocking to me, and I'll bring this up to you. You know what else happened? While kids were forced to stay home, and you approve of this, the diagnosis of youths with gender dysphoria surged. This is literally 2020, but yet this is 2021. And this is a problem. This is a major problem. And the direct effect of school closures can be seen here. These are diagnoses of gender dysphoria. And you can see it sharply increased after 20 and 21. It went up. The rates went up. So kids were forced to stay home into so-called virtual learning where they were spending a lot of time on social media, and all of a sudden we see a direct result of this. And this is a major problem. But the other problem is you had no business advising the CDC what the medical guidelines were for school closures, because now we have a nation of school children who have suffered because of it. The problem is people like you need to admit that you're just a political activist, not a teacher, not a mother, and not a medical doctor.
Ms. Gaines, as a father, I can't imagine what happened that day in that dressing room. Your day started with a man that was average at best in the sport of swimming, then claiming to be a woman or a transgender, changing in front of you and your teammates. Then your day ended with a man that tied you for the fastest time being awarded first place by the NCAA. As a young lady, you were failed at a bunch of different levels. It is unbelievable what you've been through, and I commend you and your family for being here today. I yield the rest of my time to Ms. Greene from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Strong. I'd like to continue back with talking about left-wing extremism. I think it's very important, this issue. I would like to remind everyone here, in the summer of 2020, the protests and violence in major cities all over the country were so intense, it caused over $2 billion in damage in America. This was nationwide in cities all over our country. The far-left groups that occupied Portland were there for over 100 days, causing over $2 million in damage to the federal buildings and local businesses. Seattle, protesters claimed several blocks, literally took it over in a neighborhood that they called Capitol Hill Autonomous Zones, or CHAZ, which is something that no one can comprehend. How an Antifa group and left-wing extremist group can come in and literally take over city blocks. And I just wonder, Ms. Spitalnik, I'm sorry, as senior advisor on extremism at Human Rights First, which is a nonpartisan organization, have you studied Antifa?
No, I have not studied Antifa, but I am aware of the research that those who do study extremism across the spectrum has done that tells us that while, yes, on the left, there is oftentimes, to the extent left-wing violence exists, it tends to be focused on property damage and other acts along those lines, whereas on the right, for the most part, the violence tends to be manifesting in the sort of deadly mass acts of violence that we've been talking about here today.
Oh,
so first and foremost,
I reclaim my time. Thank you. You're with a nonpartisan organization, nonprofit, which means you raise money in a nonpartisan fashion for extremism and human rights. And so you don't consider property damage for the American people. By the way, I'm a business owner. It's really hard to run a business, especially if the entire neighborhoods and area get set on fire night after night. The police officers are attacked. They're attacking federal courthouses and making the entire community literally unlivable. It's hard to have customers come in your store, especially when you own a store or maybe you have a Wendy's franchise that gets burned to the ground. So you don't consider that worth studying, the property damage and all of the violence that happens to the American people? I would think that you consider that something worth studying and caring about, especially in a nonpartisan organization.
Again, absolutely, there is left-wing violence that does exist in certain ways. But the point that I am making is that we cannot draw false equivalencies between property damage and the death of people by mass shooters who are targeting them based on their race, their religion, or other characteristics.
Well, what about their job or their profession, like being a police officer? We could talk about the city of Atlanta. That's the state I'm from. I'm from Georgia, as a matter of fact. And there's an Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. in Atlanta. The Atlanta City Council has proposed a $90 million, that's taxpayer funded, by the way, $90 million from the taxpayers for the protection and the safety of the city of Atlanta. Well, this Antifa group has come in there and decided to take it over because they call it Cop City. You want to talk about human lives? Well, it seems to be that being a police officer is a target for Antifa because they actually murdered someone there. They actually murdered a police. Oh, you don't know. That's right, because you don't study left-wing extremism from your nonpartisan so-called nonprofit. But let me tell you about it. There was a 26-year-old activist, Manuel Tehran, shot and killed Georgia State Patrol trooper there. That was this year, you're right, not last year, it was this year. So left-wing extremism is definitely on the rise, and murder is a big part of it. I yield back, thank you.
Gentlelady yields back, and I recognize Mr. Crane for his 5 minutes.
Recognize Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're hearing a lot about funding from Democrats today as we're preparing our budget here in the House of Representatives. And I'd just like to point out, we don't have a revenue problem in Washington. We have a spending problem. And there was a lot of misuse of COVID funds during these shutdowns and a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's why we're here on the Oversight Committee today. I also wear another hat other than a congresswoman. I'm a mother. And I have 3 children, and I have children in school, or at least one of them has graduated. The other 2 are now in college. But my youngest, my son, he's graduated in the class of 2022. Now, thankfully, I'm from a red state where his high school opened up quickly. His activities resumed, but my 3 children did suffer during that time. All 3 of them lost their part-time jobs. My daughter, who was a D1 athlete in college, her sport was completely suspended for an entire season. They lost many things, but I will say that thankfully, because our schools reopened quickly, my son's education did not fall behind. But many's education did fall behind. We've talked about ACT scores. For example, approximately 42% of the graduate test takers from the high school class of 22 failed to meet the benchmark scores in English, reading, science, and math. The average of that class was 19.8 out of 36 on the ACT. This is a failure and a direct result of school closures. I'd also like to talk about, I hear a lot from my colleagues on the other side talking about vulnerable children and children in poverty and children that are at risk, especially with learning disabilities. That's something else I know about. Children with autism, Down syndrome, and other disorders, they went without their therapies, tutoring, and many other things that they were used to receiving when they were in person in education in schools. That was detrimental. I have a family from my district whose daughter with autism completely quit speaking after years and years of therapy that she had finally begun to speak, and she quit speaking again when her therapies were discontinued. I think that's a complete failure. But the most devastating effect that I think that we all saw was the suicide increase in children. It's unthinkable to me that any child would commit suicide, and I know all of you on the panel agree with that. But here we saw suicide increase to 6,000 suicides among the ages 10 to 24, 51% increase in suicide attempts in girls ages 12 to 17. But boys were the ones that so tragically were actually getting the job done, with the largest rate of suicide in an average of 8% increase. And so it's just completely devastating. But another thing I'd like to point out that we haven't really talked about here is the gigantic impact on mental health of our kids while they were being forced to stay home, many of them alone by themselves, sitting in front of a screen for most of their waking hours as they were trying to educate themselves with online learning, which was a failure for many. But they were also spending their time on TikTok and Instagram, which are 2 poison pills for our children's minds. And since this time, these school closures, we've seen a dramatic increase in trans-identifying children, which is something that was not normal nor common many years before this, and I think that's completely devastating. But I'd also like to point out how the AFT, the teachers union, with the teachers that, by the way, were getting paid to stay home and didn't have to go to work, were the ones talking to the CDC about when should schools reopen. And then we had governors of blue states. So I'd like to ask each of you, and each of you take your turn, if you had the chance to explain with your experience and knowledge that you have about the horrific failures of the COVID shutdowns, what would you say to Randy Weingarten, who I would prefer to be on this panel today? I think that's who we should be talking to. Or what would you say to CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, who I also think we should be questioning today? Mr. Zywig, if you had questions for her, what would you ask? And then I'd like to hear from each witness. Thank you.
I would ask Dr. Walensky why the evidence that existed in front of us, real-world observational evidence, was dismissed or ignored, and instead we focused on projections and models about what would happen. That is against sort of fundamentals in the hierarchy of evidence when you look at, and we chose to look at a lower form of evidence and prioritize that over real-world evidence that was occurring. And I'd like to understand why that happened.
Thank you. Dr. Hogue?
Yeah, so I would like to discuss with Randy Weingarten about the perceived risks both to teachers and children, as I do think that there was a misunderstanding and a miscalculation about the many risks that children face and about the risks that teachers faced also from children. But I would like to ask Dr. Walensky, why, when she was creating the guidance for reopening the schools in February of 2021, that she was using the wording of the teachers' unions in terms of requiring 6 feet of distance and not actually consulting the scientists and physicians who were doing the actual research, looking at amount of distancing and transmission in schools, and why it seemed like the teachers' unions had a more dominant voice in creating those guidelines than the scientists did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Gentles.
Yeah, I think that if I had the opportunity to speak with Randy Weingarten, I'd ask her about what her conversations are like with teachers in urban districts that were closed and did not serve students. What is it like to talk to teachers in Baltimore at schools that have 0% students proficient, 0? Mm-hmm. And what is it like to talk to teachers in Newark that have less than 2% of their students proficient in math? What is she advising those teachers now when they say, what do we do? How do we teach these kids? How do we turn this around? She has to take responsibility for keeping those schools closed and creating the situation for her members, for her teachers. What is she going to tell them to do now?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Ms. Mazik.
I would speak from a public health perspective from the federal, state, and local level and ask for a way to communicate lessons learned. After action plans are very common in dealing with emergencies. I think that needs to happen on all levels so that we know what to do the next time we have a pandemic.
Thank you very much. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. A lot of this has already been said, but I'm going to state it anyways because I do think it's important. But early on,